For today's classic interview, we're going back to my interview in October of 2014 with Bill Bowring. And I don't think I really have to explain the relevance of this interview to you. This interview was about how did Putin's Russia become Putin's Russia? And we talked about a lot of aspects of Vladimir Putin's past and most recent escapades. And I think it's particularly interesting given what we now know about Vladimir Putin that we didn't know in October of 2014 to rewatch this interview. So we'll get right into it. My interview with Bill Bowring from 2014. How did Vladimir Putin's Russia become what it is? I'm joined today by Professor Bill Bowring, who is Professor of Law at the Birkbeck University of London, also author of Law, Rights, and Ideology in Russia, Landmarks in the Destiny of a Great Power. It's really great to have you on, and I think a lot of our audience is very aware of the last 2 to 4 to maybe 10 years of history in Russia. They're, of course, following, as we are, some of the moves that have been made by Vladimir Putin. But most people don't have a sense of how, going all the way back several hundred years, what we're seeing today in Russia connects to an ideology and a framework from years past. So let's start laying it out as broadly as possible. What was the catalyst, as you may call it, that set Russia on the path which we're now observing?
Well, I'd like to go back to the 16th century when you had Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV in Moscow, and Queen Elizabeth I in England. And actually, that's when you have the beginning of Russia, Moscow and then Russia, as a great continental empire, and the beginning of England as a worldwide maritime empire. That was really England's defeat of the Spanish. And what a lot of people don't know is that Ivan the Terrible proposed marriage to Elizabeth I, and she told him to get lost. But something which I often stress is that England and Russia have been on the same side of practically every war, with the exception of the Crimean War. And in fact, the two empires grew in a way which didn't really lead to conflict, because Russia was spreading across the Eurasian continent, Britain was spreading around the world through sea power. And both Russia and Britain are suffering at the present moment from a deep psychological trauma, which is the loss of empire in the really quite recent past.
And is that what you feel is today a great driver or catalyst for the more, we have these kind of conflicting sides within Russia, right? There's the Westernizers, and as we saw, that was certainly a big issue in the conflict with Ukraine and involving Crimea. And then you have those who are more kind of the Slavophiles, or the I don't know what other term there may be. But for a long time, there have been these two camps, have there not?
Well, I would say the ideology of the present regime in Russia, the ideology, is that what unites Putin and the people around him is that they want Russia to be a great power and to be recognized and respected as such around the world. So I would say the Russian leadership see the world in geopolitical terms, and therefore the interpretation of what's been happening in Ukraine from the Russian regime's point of view is that Russia is encircled by the United States and its allies, and Ukraine was really a step too far for NATO in particular. So I think that's not the only factor, but I think that explains quite a bit of the way that the Russian regime has been acting.
I find it very interesting that with some countries, there is a kind of less circuitous history with regard to the direction that the country has gone in than Russia. And if you look, of course, we have in World War II, Russia's influence with the Allies, and we know about that. But even going back further, during the 1860s, we saw the abolition of serfdom. We saw the introduction of the jury trial. These were reforms that we saw in Russia that may not necessarily always be associated with the kind of public face of Vladimir Putin today.
I think this is extremely important. And actually, Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861, several years before the United States abolished slavery. And why did he do that, which was a massive step? It was because Russia had been defeated in the Crimean War by Britain and France. And that was just a huge shock, because after the defeat of Napoleon, we tend to forget that the Russian army marched all the way to Paris, defeating Napoleon on the way. So after 1812, they arrived in Paris in 1814, marched through Paris in extremely good order, and went home again, having done the job. So Russia, after 1814, thought it was invincible. And then to lose the Crimean War not very many years later, that was a massive shock. And so we had the huge legal reforms, and in fact, jury trial, introduced in 1864 throughout the whole of the Russian Empire. That continued right up until 1917. And one of the big steps in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union has been the reintroduction of jury trial throughout Russia. And we also tend to forget that Putin, in the first 3 years that he was president, so up until he arrested Mr. Khodorkovsky in 2003, he actually cited the great legal reformers of the 19th century and presented himself as being the heir of Alexander II. So, and that went into reverse. The other side, of course, of what Putin was doing between 2000 and 2003 was the Second Chechen War, which was absolutely vicious. But within Russia itself, there were very serious legal reforms, including the reintroduction of jury trial.
What do you think is mostly responsible, if it's even possible to sum things up? I mean, of course, there's so many facets to this, but how would you characterize the primary catalyst for what we've seen happen within Russia over the last 6 to 8 to 10 years? Do you think that this is an issue of a desire to maintain this kind of caricature of Russian sovereignty, which clearly has been an important thing, at least in kind of this theoretical way, to Vladimir Putin? Or how would you assess the catalyzing factors for the recent decade or so of Russian policy?
Well, I would say the key factor is that Russia and China, of course, many Russians look at China very closely, followed very different paths. So Russia went for really dismantling the Soviet system with a wholesale attack on the Communist Party in the early years of Boris Yeltsin, really as the first step before liberalizing the economy, whereas, of course, China went the other way and kept the iron control of the Communist Party as the basis for liberalizing the economy. So very different paths. And of course, in Russia during the 1990s, there was absolute chaos with a president who was drinking a quart of vodka every day and was frequently drunk in public. So people look back at that kind of wild period of the 1990s with horror. So a lot of the secret of Putin has been that you have an individual who is sober, who presents himself as being a strong man, who's a black belt in judo. And of course, he has been very fortunate because up until very recently, we've had very high oil prices. And that has actually funded a situation in Russia where, of course, a few people get ridiculously rich, but everybody has become better off. And people have actually been paid on time until this year, when oil prices, of course, have gone through the floor. And once again in Russia, there's a very serious situation. If I could just say a word about ideology here, which is that you mentioned sovereignty, very, very important. So if you want to know what is the ideological slogan, as it were, of the regime, it is sovereignty and sovereign democracy. This is the invention of a chap called Surkov, who is he's a younger generation, very much the ideologist of the regime. And in 2006, a book was published called Sovereignty, Suverenitet, edited by one of the group of young conservatives around Putin, and with chapters by Putin, Medvedev, Surkov, edited by a young conservative called Garaja. And the theoretical center of this book, bizarrely, is the thought of the Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt, And the central chapter is by the leading Russian expert on Carl Schmitt, who translates his work from German into Russian, called Sovereignty as a Political Choice. There you are. I think that is right at the center of the thinking of the regime in Russia at the moment.
Well, and it's fascinating because in a place as different from the United States as Russia, you still see this caricature of sovereignty and this calling card of sovereignty being used in a way that is not that different. As we've seen here in the US, groups like the Tea Party and anarcho-libertarian groups co-opting this concept of sovereignty also for their own political gain. And while the groups could not be more different than the political forces in Russia, you can't help but see the similarity there.
Well, I mean, I think it's very interesting that some of those people really admire what Putin is doing at the moment.
They do. That's actually interesting. They do admire it, yeah.
And that's because of his very pronounced conservative turn since 2012. And what I find very interesting is that Medvedev, of course, during his 4 years as president, he was ultimately under the control of Putin, nonetheless introduced some liberal reforms and brought some liberals into government. And since Putin came back in 2012, all of that is being dismantled, mostly has been dismantled. And the people Medvedev brought in have been got rid of. And there's only one left, who's the Minister of Justice, Mr. Konovalov. And really, this is a whole series of things, but amongst them, of course, social conservatism. So on the question of the attitude towards homosexuals and gays, LBTI, etc., Putin has taken a radically conservative turn, which is welcomed by many conservatives in Europe and the United States.
No question about it. We've been speaking with Professor Bill Bowring. The book is Law, Rights, and Ideology in Russia, Landmarks in the Destiny of a Great Power. Really great to have you on. Thank you so much.
I enjoyed that. Thank you.